It's great to be with everyone and to have the opportunity to talk about strengths to make it through. I really enjoy this conversation and looking forward to getting feedback and hearing from you as we go along. As Sam mentioned, this is the first in a series of webinars under the banner of Discovering Your Family's Strengths. And this, let me get here so that's a little better for you. And this webinar is really focused, building on the research we did in the American Family Asset Study that we released a little while ago. And it's really, we're planning to host a couple of webinars, 5 webinars every other month on this series. And so let me just give you a quick background on this research. We're not going to spend a lot of time with that, but just so you know where it comes from. We released in 2012 a study that we called the American Family Assets Study, and it's available online if you want to track that down, which was a study of 1,500 families in which we surveyed both parenting adults and 10 to 15-year-olds in each family and tried to understand the strengths in those families and sort of what are the dynamics in the families. It's a quite diverse sample, representative sample of a wide range of Americans in the United States, and then we weighted the results to the U.S. Census. We've done a couple of presentations on that I've listed those on the whole study that I've listed on this slide. One is the webinar we did on Parent Further when we first released the study, and then we were involved in a symposium with Walt Disney Parks and Resorts for their corporate citizenship team, and they videotaped that, and that symposium is available to view at DisneyDiscoverTogether.com. So those are some resources if you're interested in more of the background on the study that you can go to. Today what we're going to do, though, is really focus in on particular aspects of the study. So just a bit more context, there were 5 different categories of strengths that we identified, and identified 21 family assets within those categories. These categories are around nurturing the relationships in the family, establishing routines in the family, maintaining expectations about what each of us does as part of our families, adapting to challenges, and then how does the family connect to the community. And each of those, there are specific strengths within each of those that are really important for kids' outcomes. Today we're going to focus on the adapting to challenges category and what's going on in that, and some of what can we learn about that. We're obviously doing these in a different order from how they show up on a piece of paper, but they're not linear. They're really a interactive set of strengths in families, and we sort of shift them around to fit with the flow of a year. So we'll see how this goes. So to get us into the topic, what we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit about families, the challenges families face, a little bit about the notions of resilience. Many of you are familiar with that concept, but let's talk about what that is and how it plays out in this framework. Talk about how families adapt to challenges, some of the specific strengths that we found in our research there, and then we'll close by looking at some strategies for parents and for families themselves, as well as for people who work with families, because we know both groups are part of these webinars typically. To get us started, though, what I want you to do is to give your own personal frame of reference for the conversation today. And this is really just for your own reflection, to center yourself around think for yourself, what are some of the experiences you've had yourself or in the families you've worked with that are on your mind as you begin this conversation? What challenges have you faced or do they face? What are some of those, how have those experiences shaped you or shaped them? And then you can keep these thoughts private, or if you like, you can share them in the chat session, and we'll be able to see that and begin to understand what people are bringing to the conversation. For me, just as an example, for me, I'm actually remember often a major event in my life when I was 16 years old. My parents were in a car accident in which my mom had a serious brain injury. We were actually overseas at the time where we were living, and ended up flying back to the States with an emergency situation, and then moving here. And so a major shift in our family, moving from one continent to another with a disabled mom and all of the things that come with that. And at some level, you say that's just terrible, and it was. And yet, for me, it's actually quite rewarding and enriching to reflect on those experiences and to remember all of the strengths in our family and the community and the people around us who helped us get through that and helped us even thrive in some senses in the midst of that. So I'd like you, as you're thinking about your own experiences in your own families and the families you work with, to as we're talking, think about those kinds of things that may have been present in your own families. So to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to Sam to do a quick poll of you to sort of see what you're bringing as a primary interest to this webinar.
Thanks, Gene.
Sam, are you there?
I am here. Sorry about that. Just getting the poll loaded. I've also had a lot of people telling us what they're reflecting on today. It's been a big variety of issues, everything from being a single parent to the technology gap they're experiencing with their children, to bigger issues like incarceration and alcohol abuse and abuse. And so just a wide variety of things have come up. So as you can all see, I have launched the poll. The poll is, which of the following is your primary interest in participating in this webinar? So you can select one. It's help my own family deal with everyday stresses, help my own family deal with a major challenge, support families I work with in dealing with everyday stresses, support families I work with in overcoming major challenges. I'm not really sure what that little symbol is, but I think you can all see that, and it looks like we've had about 77% of those on the line have taken the poll, so I'll leave it open for a few more seconds. And I just keep having people's answers coming in, really appreciate them for sharing. So, all right, I'm going to close the poll now, and I will show the results. And it looks like 18% say they are here to help their own family deal with everyday stresses. 7% say help their own family deal with major challenges. 49% say support the families I work with in dealing with everyday stresses. And 25% say support the families I work with in overcoming major challenges. So thank you all for participating. We really appreciate it. Okay.
Great, and thank you, Sam. And as I was listening, I heard some of the kinds of challenges that we'll be talking about that are actually part of some of the research here, so hopefully that will follow along just well. As we're having these conversations, what I want us to sort of keep in mind as sort of underlying themes that will come up through time is the notion of what family strengths do. And so throughout you'll hear me respond a number of times that the strengths help manage everyday challenges as well as coping with crises as well as recovering from trauma. So the crisis may be sustained or temporary, but in those cases those are really elements of family resilience. The other couple of things that we'll talk about is the notion of the power of everyday actions, that it's not necessarily the big stuff that makes all the difference. Sometimes it's the little stuff that really is what pulls us through. And then finally, it shouldn't surprise you from Search Institute, but it's true in the research that in the end, a lot of the strength that comes in these in family strengths and in helping us through difficult times is in relationships. So those are things that will come up again and again in our conversation for those of you who like to know where this is going. So let's start by just talking about some of the challenges that families face. And some of these you've talked about in your chats and probably in your reflections. When we surveyed these 1,500 families, we asked about how much they had experienced a variety of challenges in the past couple of years and in their lifetime. And this is just the percentages of those who responded in 2011 that say that their family had experienced these things in the past 2 years. At that point, we were just on the tail end of the recession that I'm told is over. I'm not always sure. And so 30% of the families, a third of the families say that their family had experienced that. People dealing with serious illness and disability, loss of jobs, unemployment, death in the family, dealing with a disability, serious accident, all of these kinds of things. And we asked about 13 of these different kinds of challenges that families had faced, and you see these percentages here. When we put together a scale that measured this, we'll talk about a little bit later, only about 12% of the families said that their family had experienced none of those. And then 50% reported a score of 6 or lower, which was probably 1 or 2 of the challenges at the most, and the mean was a score of 9 out of 75 when we put it all together. So there's many families that don't experience a lot, but there's some families that are experiencing multiple challenges in their lives. And so that gives us a bit of a context. And part of what the point is that all families are experiencing challenges. It's not sort of one group of families that experience challenges and not others. Some families experience deeper challenges and more chronic challenges, but the reality is we all face some challenges, and so we're all in this together in that way. Today, as you know, likely know, there's a lot of focus on the notion of childhood trauma, which is one way of thinking about the challenges that families face. And I think that's actually a good thing in the sense that we're beginning to understand how the experiences in childhood have this lasting effect into adulthood, and how do we mitigate those challenges, how do we deal with reducing the adverse childhood experiences that our kids have. And it allows us then to begin investing in and understanding those things within the context of our kids' lives. I think there is a risk to this, and this is the same risk the Search Institute has talked about for a number of years in other contexts, is that when you focus only on the challenges, only on the trauma, there's a danger of reinforcing perceptions of families and youth as being dysfunctional. And the sense of inevitability. In the science, they talk about these things as being determinants of long-term outcomes, and that's sort of a sense of it's going to happen, there's nothing you can do about it. And I think what I'm offering and suggesting is, yeah, trauma it does have negative effects. It is a problem. Engagement and risk are problems. And at the same time, the literature on resilience that we'll talk about begins to suggest that, that there's also another side to the story that isn't about inevitability, but it's about resilience coming and even thriving in the midst of some of the challenges that many people do. I love this quote from Froma Walsh, who's been one of the pioneers in family resilience, where she said, in talking about the focus on risks and trauma, it says, most studies tend to dismiss the family as hopelessly dysfunctional and then to seek positive extra-familial resources to counter the negative impact. So if the family is dysfunctional, you have to go outside the family to deal with the strength. Thus, families are seen as only as contributing to risk, but not to resilience. And that becomes a problem. And as I talk with leaders in youth-serving organizations and schools, social service agencies, I often get the sense that they've given up on families. There's a sense that families have messed up our kids, and I'm being facetious at some level. They've messed up our kids, and it's our job to fix that from the outside. And I think that's undermining the strength that we need to begin figuring out how to cultivate, nurture, and celebrate in families, even in the midst of difficult challenges they're facing. At the same time, when I talk to families, they feel like in the midst of their challenges, no one listens, and sometimes they sense that no one even cares. And so these two dynamics of the professionals saying families have messed everything up, and then families say nobody cares, tends to feed off of each other, and so we end up without the productive processes that need to happen to tap the strengths of families and develop the strengths of families. So let's talk a little bit more then about the notions of resilience and what's in that whole concept. And it's a huge concept with lots of research and lots of researchers in different fields dealing with this. I found this definition from a website for This Emotional Life, which was a really interesting PBS show a few years ago, was very useful. That resilience is the capacity to withstand traumatic and stressful experiences. They continue, people who are resilient draw on strengths in themselves, their relationships, and their communities to help overcome adversity. So it's this notion that we have strengths that even in the midst of the challenges, we have capacity to overcome adversity, to withstand some of the trauma, and in some of the research is highlighting the notion of how do people, even in the midst of trauma, are thriving and high levels of well-being. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things that the resilient scholars talk about is that it was when it was first came out, people talked a lot about super kids and invulnerable kids and these kind of things, and actually the research, that's not what the research is showing. That makes it set aside that there's a few kids who can be resilient because of some kind of unique quality in them. And what the research in resilience actually points to is this wonderful quote from Ann Maston, who's one of the great scholars in this field. Resilience does not come from rare and special qualities, but from the everyday magic of ordinary, normal human resources in the minds, brains, and bodies of our children, in their families and relationships, and in their communities. So again, reinforcing this notion that it's not big stuff that necessarily matters. It's not sort of some hidden quality of a few kids that makes a difference. It's about the strengths that we have in ourselves and our families, our communities, that makes a difference. And Ann's quote was the inspiration, along with the current TV show, that inspired the title for our first webinar when we talked about the ordinary magic of modern families. So how does this all fit with family assets? So just this diagram suggests what we all assume and know and what the research would bear out, that stressful events in the life of a family and a kid have a negative influence on a young person's well-being. So bad stuff happens, it has the potential of having this negative influence, that the outcomes are worse for the kid. But what happens if you add family assets into that? How might that change the equation? And so we did that. We did some analyses in our data set to look at how that relationship played out. So here's how we did it, just to give you a little bit of background. We identified in a survey, I mentioned, the 13 stressful life events, and we've highlighted those a bit earlier, and we created an index of those. And so you see everything from separation or divorce, illness, military deployment, being a victim of crime, struggling with alcohol abuse or other drug abuse, being involved in natural disaster, the death of a friend. You get the idea. This is tough stuff. And we created an index that factored the parents who said their families had these either recently or in the past, and we gave them different weights and put together an index that scored from 0 to 75. 75 being a family that experienced everything very recently. And fortunately, there were no families in the sample that was the case for. And so then we pulled out of that sample, we looked at the frequency. So as you can see here from this slide, many of the families scored 10 or lower. We identified 14% of the families, or about 200 families, who scored 17 or higher. The number isn't important as much as saying this is about 15% of the families who, if you factor in all of those things, are reporting that several of those things happen for them, suggesting that they have a fairly high level of risk or stress in their family life, even trauma. And the research consistently shows that there's a spiral accumulating effect of multiple risks and stresses of that having a negative impact in families. So then we said, okay, let's look at those families and compare those families, the young people in those families who have high levels of family assets, to those who report having lower levels of family assets. And so, and this is a little complicated, we calculated odds ratios, which is a way of looking at what are the odds that someone will be doing better based on factors that you put into the equation. And so we first controlled for a number of demographic variables, and then we said, we looked at these four outcomes that I'll show you. The first one, personal responsibility. And what we found is that if young people in high-stress families experience high levels of family assets, they're 9 times more likely to exhibit personal responsibility than youth in high-stress families who experience low levels of family assets. So again, there's all kids who've experienced high levels of stress, and the factor we added to the equation was the family assets. So they're 9 times more likely to experience exhibit personal responsibility if they have high levels of family assets than if they have a low level of family assets. 7 times as likely to exhibit self-regulation. 7 times as likely to exhibit school engagement, to be showing up to school ready to learn. And then 5 times as likely to exhibit caring. So again, all of these are looking at families that have high levels of stress in their lives and factoring in a number of family strengths across the whole framework. And we see these fairly significant correlations. And our conclusion is that higher levels of family assets in families that have experienced high stress are associated with greater odds that young people will thrive even in the midst of challenges. So again, having strength in your family doesn't eliminate the challenges. It's not a nirvana. It's a resource to help you get through those things when they happen. So the idea of nurturing a range of family strength, a broad foundation of family strengths, is foundational then to dealing with resilience in the face of sometimes pretty challenging issues that come up in families' lives, like the 13 that we included in our scale. The other side is just the everyday adaptability. Things happen, life happens. We're dealing with just the everyday challenges of life. And so let's focus then on let's look at the specific strengths in the framework that focus on the adaptability within families. So in our framework, the adapting to challenges category has 4 strengths of 4 family assets that we'll talk about. And we'll just dig a little bit deeper into the research on each of these for a few minutes here. How does a family manage daily commitments around school, work, family life, other responsibilities? Adaptability, how's the family able to adapt to challenges? Problem-solving skills within the family, and how the family makes decisions are all the kinds of strengths that when present in a family that we found to be contributing to overall strength in the family. So with that in mind, turn it over to Sam to do another quick poll.
Thanks. Thanks, Jean. All right, I'm going to launch the poll now. The poll is, which of these is hardest for your family? And it's those 4 areas that Jean just described: managing daily commitments, being adaptable, solving problems together, and making decisions together. So we will leave that open for you to vote for a little bit. I think I will ask Jean a question while we're waiting for people to vote. So we had a couple of questions that came up during your discussion of resilience, and so I thought I'd hit on those right now. One question was, how is personal responsibility measured in the study when you were talking about resilience?
In this study, personal responsibility was measured about whether young people, when things happen, whether they own the responsibility for that or turn it over to someone else. So it's really around their sense of self-efficacy and feeling responsible for things that happen and that they're part of.
Okay. And then the second question about resilience that I wanted to touch on it's from Kelly, and she says, I often differentiate between resilience factors and developmental assets by saying developmental family assets protect, whereas resilience factors preserve. Is that an accurate distinction in how you see these constructs?
That's fascinating. I kind of like that. I think I would argue that the family assets actually, I tend to put them as promoting, that they're promoting thriving as well as protecting. And the resilience literature tends to emphasize the situations that people in resilience as being part of a particular focus on families that are particularly facing significant challenges or trauma. So, but I like the idea. That's a cool idea. I like that framing.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to close the poll now since we've had plenty of time to vote and share the results. And it looks like 30% of our audience says managing daily commitments, 21% said being adaptable, 28% said solving problems together, and 22% said making decisions together. So kind of all across the board there. So
great.
Okay.
And we'll just see what they said in the survey that we did. Different questions, but just kind of fun. In the survey, the one that people said was the easiest or the strongest for them was around decision making. That shared decision making. The ones that the families we surveyed tend to struggle with the most were around the adaptability and problem solving. And so just again, the differences in where these families were seeing strength. And by the way, the category of adapting to challenges was one that tended to be lower among the families. There were two others were much higher around the routines and the relationships. This one tended to be lower. That's one thing. There's others who managing daily commitments is about multiple jobs to make ends meet, taking caregiving for a relative in a sustained time, and then many of us it's juggling work and school and community participation, other activities. And part of what can happen in families is these activities, the busyness of family life, can squeeze out some of the other strengths that are important in families around the time we want to have together, having fun together, and the couple time. Many times couples in relationship in a family will sacrifice their couple relationship to sort of do all this other stuff, and that becomes problematic in other ways. So managing these daily commitments is a real issue for many families. I think there's a really interesting question about where technology helps or hurts in this mix. We don't have good evidence of that in the survey. You could argue that it helps us manage because we can stay in touch and coordinate and all of that. Does it also because we're so busy? There's a study just out in the last couple of weeks about parents of young children texting and using their cell phones with their young kids and never actually paying attention to their young kids. So I think as we're thinking about the daily commitments and those kind of things, I think we need to integrate our management of technology into those conversations as well. When I looked at the research on managing daily commitments and the journal articles listed here, there's actually really important things that families can do to manage daily commitments that end up having positive outcomes. So when families are working together, and again that's key, when you get together in a family to really actually talk about those and negotiate those multiple commitments, make changes in light of each other's competing interests and demands, so sort of the give and take. When families provide mutual support, so we're helping each other out and we're showing care for each other in the midst of the craziness, and then when we take time to do the things we enjoy, those are the kinds of things that in the midst of lots of daily commitments that help us. And so the point here is we all wish we might get to a point where we get the nirvana where we're never going to have competing demands or tight schedules or multiple things going on in our lives. If you figure out how to do that, send me an email. I think what this research is suggesting, in the midst of that, there are things we can do that make life better and help us live within the challenges of modern life. It doesn't mean we don't set boundaries, by the way, but it does mean that we find ways in the midst of that to work together as a family to manage those daily commitments. The next asset in this category is around adaptability. And so how do we adjust to new realities? Things change in our family. How do we change with that? How do we navigate new relationships with each other as our kids grow up? How do we begin to understand them differently at different developmental ages? Changing those relationships, the roles. Kids move into greater and greater autonomy, which shifts how we do things. They develop new capacities and interests, which may shift our daily commitments and responsibilities, and all of those things. The other important thing is to say that the notion of adaptability is actually in a dynamic relationship with structure and routines that we'll talk about next time in the webinar. And in David Olson's family circumplex model, which is sort of one of the foundational understanding of healthy family systems, he puts these in an interesting dynamic relationship, so that if you get too much adaptability without appropriate routine and structure, you end up chaotic. But if you get so structured without any adaptability, it gets rigid and very cold. And so how do we begin in our families? How do we work with families to find that appropriate balance? So I think that's what adaptability, this asset, invites us to work on. Problem solving is the third asset in this category, and for us there are two elements in this, and when we did the analysis that came through. One is sort of the practical strategies of problem solving. So what are the ways we tackle issues instead of putting them off, work together to solve the problems, accept responsibility rather than blaming others. These were all parts of the definition of that. And then throughout the problem solving, how do we make sure that our focus is on maintaining the relationship? Because in the end, undermining the relationships in a way becomes more problematic in most cases than whether we solve a particular problem on a particular day. So that would be the one piece, the practical issues of problem solving and learning to solve problems in ways that maintain relationship and that help us all learn and grow and achieve our goals. The other piece to problem solving is this notion of meaning making. In the midst of adversity, finding meaning is a key part of resilience and a key part of adapting. So, and as you talk to people, there's a variety of ways people do that. Some people tap religious or spiritual resources or narratives. Some people will tell stories. So, for example, when someone passes away, you might tell stories about their lives and remember their narrative as part of a way of celebrating that. And that's one of the ways of making meaning of the transition. Some people will invest in a cause or a person. One of my friends is Patty Wetterling, whose son was abducted many years ago, and that became a cause for her, a way she could invest in making sure that didn't happen again. And through all of that, finding a way to find hope even in the midst of difficulty, trauma, and tragedy. And so many different ways that families do that, but that's an important part of solving problems. The final asset in this category is the asset of democratic decision making. And much of the research really focuses on who makes the decision, and I think that for us it's perhaps even more important to talk about how the decisions are made. So it's not about the decisional authority as much about the interactions around decisions, because as we engage kids and our families together in decision making, they learn skills to do this, and they feel ownership, and they have a sense of self-efficacy in the midst of things, and like things aren't out of control, they have a role in that. So how can we begin to engage people in that problem solving? And obviously the decision role shifts over time. Infants have a different role in decision making than a 16-year-old or a 23-year-old. And so how do we begin? Again, that's part of the adapting to things. I've always assumed and even said that, you know, responsibility grows over time, and so maybe collaborative decision making grows over time. And recently I've been reading some articles on collaborative decision making, and I've come to a different conclusion. And I think that young people can play important roles even in major decisions. And I come to that out of the research on chronic illness, managing chronic illness in children, where they're examining what makes for the best care for children. What are the things that help make sure the treatment plans are followed and that the kids are doing what they can to manage their illness. And so what those researchers finding is that as they talk to families who figure that out, they find things that families do that have low collaboration, and those are listed here around. Sometimes the parent just defers to the child, whatever the kid wants, and sometimes the parent just decides on their own. And somewhere in the middle, the parents may give options, and sometimes the parent may just explain why they've done things, and that's medium. What they're finding is that optimal care happens when parents and kids are actively talking about pros and cons of the options. Parents are suggesting ideas and options, and kids are as well, and they're finding solutions that work for both of them. Now, I'm not saying you should do that on everything, but for me, this research reminds me to take kids seriously, even in difficult, challenging decisions. I know in my own family, we faced some major decisions with one of our sons. And they were big decisions, they were life decisions. And by doing that together with him through that process, we learned so much about the capacities he had that we were surprised by his ability to be responsible, thoughtful, collaborative in the decision-making process. And so I know all decisions are not the same, situations are different, kids are different, but I'm inviting us to consider that even in many of the decisions we make in our families, that young people can and and do well to have a role, and it helps them learn and grow and actually helps the decision have more meaning and stick in a family's life. So I would offer that as something for us to consider as we think about these things. So there you have four assets within the category of adaptability, and to me they begin to point to some practical things that families can do, some strategies that families can do. So just want to wrap up with a few strategies for families and a few strategies for people who work with families. And we've outlined 10 of them, and you'll see those. We'll go through those quickly. I'm not going to go through in detail with each one of them. First one, build on a foundation of strength through smaller challenges to help with the bigger ones. Obviously, there's skills in this that need to happen. So as we engage young people and practicing some of these things, then when bigger stuff happens, we have some skills, we have some history, we have some habits or patterns in place that we can draw on and rely on. Number two, being intentional about spending time together. And for me, at one point in my life when my kids were little, my wife and I realized we were never spending time together. We were just getting sucked into kid care all the time. And we actually became intentional about regularly taking a day off when our kids were in school just to be together, because we didn't have to deal with child care, we didn't have to deal with babysitters, we could just have time together. And that's frankly a practice we've tried to keep up because we know how important that is. So finding those ways that are available to you where you can find the time together, even if it's just a little time. Avoiding blaming and shaming, that seems obvious, but it's important. Solving problems and making decisions together, we've talked a lot about that. Maintaining rituals and routines that make life a little better, and we'll talk about that a lot more in the next webinar. The notion that in the midst of challenging, difficult times, sometimes those rituals and routines are part of what keeps you sane. Next set, getting support from and help from caring adults. Working on that, paying attention to transitions and milestones. Both of those can be important opportunities for growth. They can be big challenges. And so how do we, when we're anticipating a big change, how do we get thoughtful in preparing for that when we can? And using that as a way to grow and learn. Being intentional about meaning making, putting those relationships first, and being patient both with yourself and others. I mean, this stuff doesn't, you don't have to be perfect to be a parent, thankfully. I'm very happy about that. And so being intentional and working on it and knowing that we and our kids are resilient and have capacities sometimes to even recover from the mistakes we make. Then some quick strategies for those who work with families. First of all, as a context, for me it's about reframing the emphasis. So when families are under stress and facing challenges, how do we shift from primarily focusing on their problems and the services we can do for them? And they may need services, but if that's our primary interest, how do we begin shifting to recognizing and tapping and really be intentionally strengthening their own internal resources and capacities, the web of relationships that they have, and the capacity they have to contribute. So again, not taking away their sense of power, self-efficacy, dignity in the services and the ways we support them. And all of those things help grow with keys to growing in the midst of the challenges. So we'll give 10 strategies for supporters as well. Again, reinforce, don't replace family strengths. Giving time to talk things through when they're ready. So sometimes it's not so much what we do or say, it's more what we listen to. And people in difficult, challenging situations often just need someone to listen to them. Sometimes they're not ready for that, but when they're ready, to be a welcoming ear. Being proactive and not pesky. That's hard. It's a balancing act. When families get into serious trauma and difficult situations, it's really easy to circle the wagons and sort of close in on the things that are familiar. And people from the outside inviting, being available to offer support, sometimes you have to be proactive with that because they don't have the energy to reach out necessarily. So how can that be part of what the community is? And can you have a relationship in place that makes that not a surprise but a natural part of the relationship? helping families connect with people you trust, that they trust. Don't assume that you're the best person or organization to do that. They may have someone else that really is valuable to them, and your job might be to help them find that person. Walking alongside them, helping them navigate systems, all of those kinds of things are important. Offering specific support. It's really easy. I know when my father died a few years ago, I remember many people saying, let me know if you need anything, and you say, yeah. But when you're overwhelmed, it can feel like, and life feels like you're in chaos. That's hard to think through what they might do. Whereas when people said, may I make some phone calls to let people know, that's a very specific request that was more actionable, and I could say, yeah, that's something that we'd love to have your help with. Advocate on the family's behalf. Again, that's really hard when you're in the midst of trauma to sort of take on the system. So they sometimes need advocates alongside them. Making it possible for them to take breaks. This is really true for chronic caregiving situations. How do you help them with that and those stresses? And then let families make meaning in ways that work for them. I mentioned earlier when my parents were in a car accident and my mom was injured, the number of people who said things that were unhelpful, things like it all works together for good in the end, that didn't really help us much at the time. And more helpful, that wasn't the way we needed to make meaning of it at the time. More helpful to us were those people who listened to us and let us know they're walking alongside us through the challenging times. And so beginning, again, recognizing that families will make meaning in different ways based on their own beliefs, experience, traditions, and giving them space to do that. So those are some ideas, and I think we have some time for some questions. And Sam, I think you've been gathering some.
I have, Jean. I have many questions, and I'm sure there's going to be more coming in, so let's get started. So I'm going to actually combine a couple questions because we've had several questions about single parenting and dealing with divorce. I mean, it's a big topic, and we know a lot of people personally deal with it, and we work with people who deal with that. So the first part of that is what's the first step to developing a healthy environment when you're dealing with a divorce and kind of the emotional issues that come along with that?
That's a bit outside of my area of expertise because I know there are people who specialize in understanding those dynamics. For
absolutely.
me, the one thing I would say is how can you recognize that the relationship is changing and it's a major transition, and finding a way to share values or priorities that each person in the couple shares. In many cases, that may be to say, you know, we may not want to be together anymore for whatever reason, but we do want the best for our kids. And so let's identify some of those areas where it's important to us. I would say, as I think about the categories of family assets, is how do you think about being intentional about renegotiating relationships in an honest way? How do you become intentional about new routines that give some sense of structure? I know for kids who are experiencing a separation in the family, that can be very disruptive and chaotic, to be shuffling between places. So actually looking at the framework of family strengths and family assets and saying, what are the resources here that we may have done intuitively as a family together that we're going to have to figure out how to be really intentional about ensuring we have in our two-household family, or however we frame that. So I think, you know, we're really interested at Search Institute in thinking through how the family strengths can be resources for people in transition, and obviously this is a big one, so I really do appreciate the question. I'm a little bit out of my depth in terms of actually working with families around divorce and separation issues. So hopefully that's a couple of ideas that can be useful.
Great. Yeah, I thought I'd start you off with a curveball.
Thank you.
So you're welcome. So this is another question about the framework of family assets. How does the level of caring measured in family assets relate to the developmental assets in caring?
I would have to look at the specific measures. I mean, there's similarities in the measures. One of the things I would say is in the developmental assets, we only measure the young person's perspective of that, and it's measured as support within the family. And in this research, we're looking at both the parent perspective and the child's perspective. And what's of course interesting in terms of the understanding of that is that kids and parents often have very similar experiences about that, even in the early adolescent years. The other thing I'll mention is we're actually in the midst of doing new research of understanding the nature of developmental relationships in families, where we're going to do even deeper measures of care and the different dimensions of care in young people's lives. And so that survey is just now being developed, and so we'll be, as we do the webinar in the fall on nurturing relationships, we'll introduce some of that deeper understanding of the notion of care.
Great. Another question about the family assets is, Marcia was wondering, most of the research comes from adolescents, of course. So are the family assets the same with young children?
I don't have any empirical data to say that's exactly the same. I will say that as we developed the framework, we looked at research from a variety of family settings and a variety of family ages, and we began to try to understand that a little better. Our new research that we're doing right now will actually look at developmental relationships in families down to children age 4, so that's still coming. We may have some new things to say about that. As I've talked with people about the overall framework, setting aside the particular empirical findings from it, it has resonated for people that, yeah, these are things that families in different phases of life could pay attention to. The way I would show affection to an infant would be quite different than the way I would to a 17-year-old, but I still need to show affection. The way I set expectations would be different for an infant, but might be than it would be for 17-year-olds. So the way it's manifested might be different, but I think some of these basic patterns are really in the literature on family systems, family functioning, normal family processes that you'll find there. So I would say there's something to be learned at that level, and I'd love for us to find ways as we develop the next phases of research to be able to be more articulate about that.
Along those same lines as the next phases of research, we had a question about are we considering doing a longitudinal study of families to see if the family assets change over time?
I would love to do that. We don't have, I mean, longitudinal research is what's needed, and it's very difficult to get funded. So if whoever asked the question has funding sources that they think might be interested in that, we'd love to talk about that, because yes, these things will change, and it would be fascinating to look at how strong levels of family assets at one stage in development play out in the next phase of development. And so, yeah, there's a lot we can learn by being able to follow families across time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions before we have to wrap up. So I've had, actually, I just want to address something quickly. I've had several people ask how they can work with family assets in their school district, in their religious community, as a mentor, and things like that. And we do actually have some handouts available for those, and I will make sure to put links to those in the follow-up email. So check your email and tomorrow, and you'll be able to download some of those tip sheets that we've created. So, but thanks for your questions. Really appreciate it. One question we had was actually about teen parenting, as in teens who are parents, and how the family assets might make a difference in their lives. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, again, I don't have research on that. I think what the family assets do for many families, similar to what we did with the developmental assets, is it gives a place to have conversation about where we can be intentional. And I think that for teens who become parents, sometimes it's hard to think about what you're going to do in those situations. And many of those teens desperately want to have the best family they can, even if they're starting off on the wrong foot. And so this can be a tool for helping them think about what are the things that are important to them, what are the things they want to work on, where are the areas where they need support. So I would say, yeah, I don't have research to say it matters for those families, but I think as a tool for helping people reflect on their own families, that's a real possibility. One of the things we hope we can do is actually develop a self-assessment based on this framework that would maybe give a little more depth for people to think about their own families from this perspective.
Great. I also had a couple questions about the family assets and how they differ between people of different families of different ethnicities.
Right. And we actually dealt with a lot in the first webinar, which you can check on. And what I would say is that across one of the key findings in the study is that the overall levels of family assets are fairly consistent across most of the demographic groups we studied. We didn't see major differences in family assets between low-income, high-income families, single-parent, two-parent families, gay, straight families. Where we did see some differences were between race ethnicity, with Latino and African American families having slightly higher overall levels of family assets than white and Asian American families. In all cases, the average was close to about 47 to 50 on a scale of 1 to 100. So there's no population that has huge strength just because of their demographics. And so one of the things we keep saying is demographics matter much less to family functioning than the relationships and practices of a family's life, and that all types of families have the potential of developing family strengths.
Great. All right. Thanks, Jean. I think that's all the time we have for questions. You wanted to run through some last slides for people?
Yeah, just a couple of quick resources for you. We do have stuff at our store, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I will note that some of these are specific to age groups around launching your kid into adulthood, so they really are dealing with transition points where these kind of issues and concerns may come up. So if you're interested in more resources, we do have some of those. You can go online and track them down and look them up. We have a couple of workshops that we can offer in your communities. We're just now getting these ready, so they're not actually on the website yet, but website for families around discovering your family strengths, and then a workshop that we're putting together and beginning to offer engaging the new American family, which is really relationship and strength-based strategies for nurturing families. And so if those are things you're interested in your own community organization, Mary is available for you to talk about that, since they're not quite up on the website yet, but we'll be getting those up fairly soon.
Soon, very soon.
Very soon, yes. Our next webinar is May 14th, and so we'll be talking about that category of routines, and so it'll be fun to have you come back and we can dive into that area a little more. And those routines really deal with family meals, shared activities, meaningful traditions, and being dependable to each other. So I really appreciate you joining me. As you reflect on the challenges in your own families you serve, I hope you'll notice some of these strengths in the next week or so and begin to find some practical ways to both be more intentional about nurturing the strengths and celebrating them.